Hi, everyone, and welcome to What is the Big Idea for Week 3? Well, here we are, Week 3. Big ideas. We're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects. It's toxic leaders, toxic followers, and toxic environments. We're on the last chapter of the leadership book, well, the last two chapters, but really getting into the last topic. This week, we also had just those topics, and we had two articles for you to read. We'll talk about those within this video, talking about toxic leaders and followers and environment. And then we'll talk about some of the TED Talks and other things that we have going on a little bit later. So, but before we get into the whole toxic leadership and followers and environment, one of the things that I would like to just take a quick moment and talk about, and yes, it's my cat coming to say hello, that I'd like to talk about is Abraham Maslow. So Abraham Maslow was a psychology teacher at Brooklyn College in New York City. In around 1950, he came up with this theory, and it's called the hierarchy of needs. Before he kind of started talking about this in humanistic psychology, there was Freud, who you might have heard of, in his kind of psychoanalytics, and then there was B.F. Skinner and his behavioralism, right? So you might have heard of some of those, but he was the first person to come in and start talking about people's basic needs intrinsically, some from inside. And again, is we've talked about, and we'll talk more as we get into motivational theories and things like that, is intrinsic motivation is really near and dear to me, and I think it's important to think about. So his whole idea was that people have certain levels of needs, and once you fulfill those needs, then you can go to the next step. And once you fill those needs, you go to the next step after that. And once you fill those needs, you go to the next step. So it starts with physiological needs. That would be food, water, warmth, then into security, so security and safety, belonging, which is relationships and friends, esteem needs, and then self-actualization, which is the pinnacle. So if you think about it, again, those basic needs that we have are breathing, food, water, sleep. Those are the basic needs, and once you can fulfill those, you can move to the next step. So security, that would be security of the body, like a house, something like that, employment, so that there's money coming in for your family, health, property. Then next you kind of go into that, those loving and belonging needs, which are friendships, esteem, so kind of self-esteem, kind of coming your confidence, achievement, respect of others, respecting of others, and then that self-actualization. That's the pinnacle in Maslow's thoughts. The reason I bring this up is this is going to come up a lot in when we start talking about toxic leaderships and kind of the different places. So again, another triangle. Again, leadership loves triangles. But just as we had when we were talking about general leadership, where there's just a leader, follower, and environment, there's the same thing when you get to toxic, because you can have the same kind of things, so that you can have destructive leaders, but destructive leaders need susceptible followers, and destructive leaders to susceptible followers need a conducive environment to allow this to happen. So we'll get into to each of these a little bit. So the first thing is kind of talking about this definition, the elements of toxic leadership. So it's destructive leadership is more than just a leader. As we just talked about, you have to have a destructive leader, but you also have to have some followers who are going to follow this bad leader, and you also have to have the opportunity or the environment for this person to be able to be toxic. It's rarely entirely destructive, right? So a lot of times it's a scale of people who are toxic leaders can be successful. I've been on teams with toxic leaders who we were very successful. We won, team of the year, 3 years in a row. Interestingly enough, that didn't come down to us as the team, the group, so that resulted in bad consequences of the group. It was, the leader, the manager was the person who was the kind of the highlight of it, not the team that did the work, right? And that's something that you'll see. So, why do we get toxic leaders? Where do they come from? So, if you remember in the Allure of Toxic Leadership article that we read, it kind of went through a little bit. And I really liked the way this person broke it down, because, again, One of the reasons we allow or we get toxic leaders is because of our, you know, just our needs. So if you think of Maslow, and you know, it can be those basic needs, it can be those safety needs, it can be those belonging needs, right? So and you'll see that in the next one, but just kind of those bottom two of, you know, I need to pay the bills, so I've got to put up with this person because I've got to pay the bills. So there's no way for me to leave. There's no way for me to change what I'm doing. I can remember being a young sales rep and having a really bad toxic leader who, as a matter of fact, you know, I had figured out how this account of mine was actually stealing money from the company. And when I went to the leader, he actually sided with the organization that was stealing the money from us, and I was in conflict. But at the time, I was young, newly married. They just moved us, so we were living in another place. I had a lot tied into this job, so it was kind of a scary situation for me. So the next kind of reason why we get these toxic leaders are existential needs. So that meaningful purpose, right? Are we doing something? Are we part of this group? Are we doing something? It makes us feel good belonging to the successful group, or belonging to the in crowd, or to whatever it is that's making us successful. Another topic that's brought up there is kind of the grand illusion versus the noble vision, and meaning there's a fine line between what the toxic leader is talking about, and being this great vision of, this is what we can have, this is what we can do. Really, is it really something that can happen? And that's what makes a big difference. So for a grand illusion to work, you know, it has a very high ceiling of what can do it, but you have to the team has to buy in completely. There can be no ifs, ands, or buts. You cannot question authority. It is one way, or it's no way. And the other part about the grand illusion is toxic leaders will never fulfill that promise. Even if they could, they wouldn't do it, because it's just not something that you do. And because the toxic leader is just never going to fulfill any promises that they give. They're just giving the promises to get people to do what they need. Manipulation, right? So and we'll get into that, but it's a lot more of that manipulation. So the last thing is uncertainty in a disorderly world. So no matter what organization you work for, or whatever company you work for, or what's going on, there can always be something going on in the world, or in the industry, in the company, that's uncertainty. When I was working for the pharmaceutical company, when I started with Merck, there were 8,000 primary care representatives, right? So like me, there are 7,999 others of us. When I left that company, it was down to 625. So over the 19 years that I was with them, slowly there was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of times when there was layoffs, or there was, there was just restructuring, and you didn't know if your team was going to be one. And we bought another company. I remember being on a conference call, and they went through all the teams that were safe in these two companies as they put them together. And I remember waiting, and the team I was on was never answered. They never talked about us, which meant that we were in trouble for being cut. And at one point we were. So, and there was a lot of uncertainty. So, that kind of the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know theory of, if I go to this team, or if I leave this company, will the next one be any better? So it's a lot of times why we as the followers will put up with a toxic leader and the environment, because of the uncertainty of it all. A lot of times, or that's giving that opportunity for that toxic leader to survive and to thrive. So some of the characteristics of a toxic leader, right? So they're charismatic. They're able to communicate that grand illusion, really make you believe. They're very persuasive in how they do things. Sometimes it's authoritarian, where it's, again, my way or the highway sort of thing. I remember being in an interview, and a manager said to me, "I'm hated by everybody. You don't want to be part of this team. I am hated by everybody." And it was like, wow, but, and he said, "And this is why I'm hated." And he went through his reasons, and it was all these things that were going to be great, and I was going to be great if being part of that team, right? And it's one of those things where his grand illusion really led me to believe that I was gonna be part of something special, right? So the next one, that personal use of power, I was gonna be in the group, and you're the first person I'm bringing in, and everyone's gonna judge me by how you do, right? So putting a lot of pressure on me, but those esteem needs that we just talked about, building up my esteem. You're gonna make a lot of money, yes, the safety needs, things like that. Um, we were put in the bubble. So there's a lot of times things would be happening within the company, and we'd hear about it through other teams. They'd say, how do you not know about this? There was this communication, that communication. There was a lot of things that were being blocked coming to us. Um, Negative life themes. That I haven't had or known anybody who had this, but this is something is going to set them off down this path. And then an ideology of hate. So convincing people that a certain group is bad, and we need to do this because this group is bad. You see that sometimes. You see it a lot, kind of in TV ads, especially political ads, left or right. And doesn't matter which one, but if you go far left or far right, a lot of their propaganda things, there's an ideology of hate. A person at the top of that, is making a toxic environment for everybody at that point. The next thing, again, looking at that triangle, is the followers, and there's two types, and there's two reasons why people become susceptible followers, and one are their conformer or their colluders, right? So conformers, they're allowing bad leadership because of those unmet needs. So again, go back to those Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and some of those characteristics of them. They have those unmet basic needs. They have negative, kind of evaluations of everything. Think again, kind of the lowest rung of a lot of people who do a lot of entry level jobs. So people who bounce around from entry level job to entry level job to entry level job because they don't have the ability to get to that next step. A lot of times they become conformers because they're doing it just because, well, that's just the way it is, right? And that's kind of the idea that you get. So when you get a toxic leader and they have these people who are just conforming to their needs, all you need is that right environment to really make a toxic situation. So the other group would be colluders, right? So these people see this toxic leader as or this leader, and at this point they might not be toxic, but their ambition gets in front of them. They're like, oh, these are the coattails of the person I'm going to follow, because this person is going to take me to the top. So you get behind that wrong person. You put your ambition above of kind of not thinking about it, and then all of a sudden, again, bad leader, toxic leader, you become a colluder. The right environment happens, and all of a sudden you're swept up in of what happens, and you're in a toxic situation. So the other one is here we go, the opportunity, the conducive environment. So when you think about this is kind of how this can happen. So the four environmental factors for destructive leadership. If you think about it, the absence of checks and balances. So in most places, checks and balances would be somebody watching over to make sure that it doesn't happen. In my industry, there's the FDA. In other industries, the banking industry, there's government agencies that are looking over it. A lot of times you have people who are held in check by the media. They're there to kind of fact check what's happening, making sure that what's going on is correct. Or if you even get to the higher levels, there should be a board of directors that are following to make sure that the leadership isn't bad. So that's one way that the environment, so if that's not there, you don't have those checks and balances, somebody watching you. So that's at the higher level. Think about it within your, kind of your world, the industry or company that you work for. What is that check and balance? Is it, is it the manager above the manager? Is it kind of reporting structure? Is it, types of reviews, things like that you can do to make sure that there's not a destructive or a toxic situation going on. That if you remember the article on the military, and that's one of the places where it's tough. And it's funny, I was talking to a person who is a 35-year veteran, and we were talking about this subject, and he said one of the problems that they have is is that the absence of checks and balances, because the person doesn't stay in the role that long, right? The average length is 18 months. So in 18 months, they're moving on to the next role. So they're not there long enough to really kind of, scorch the earth before they move to the next role. So that's, again, that's one of those things, is checks and balances. You're not moved because of ability, you're moved because of a time limit. So the check and balance would be ability. So, organizational, industry, national instability, as we talked about with the pharmaceutical industry, as it slowly gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Now we're starting to see it grow again, but into the specialty pharma. Again, that instability of a contraction and then growth again, and then contraction and then growth again. There's instability there. So, that allows sometimes, um, the industry starting to grow again, sometimes these people who were toxic, they move to a different company, and that company is looking to get ahead, and they're saying all the right things, and it's pushing them the right way. So there's an instability there that allows that opportunity for a toxic leader to get in there. Complexity. Think of the banking industry and kind of the mortgage industry, where they had some problems there because it was very complex how all this was happening, and we're packaging loans together, and we're doing this and we're doing that, and it's, everybody can get a loan, um, and it's one of those things that it got so complex that it was very difficult to figure out what was going on, and how people were kind of gaming the system there. And then perceived threats. So those threats can be real, or they can be made up. So sometimes you'll get a toxic leader who gets these um, followers who are, kind of the conformers, and they give them a perceived threat, and that's what it is. It's it could be a real, again, or a made up threat, and that's what sets everybody off into this toxic spiral. So what can you do about a toxic leader, right? So what happens if you're part of one, or you have one? So before you take a job, so do your homework is always my advice. There's a lot of times, especially with the internet now, there's a lot of ways of being able to learn more about the company that you're trying to find out about. In the, again, pharmaceutical and medical device, there's a board called Cafe Pharma. A lot of people just complaining on it, but you can get a feel for what are the topics that people are saying, and kind of a feel for it a little bit, just to give you a little bit of a gut instinct. There's Glassdoor, which is another one that does it. When you're interviewing, now remember, an interview is two ways, right? So you're interviewing the person as they're interviewing you. You can go on and you can check LinkedIn. You can follow people from the company. You can see if anybody knows that person, and have that discussion with them. Facebook's another way. Again, do you have mutual friends, things like that. So what happens if you're in the company and all of a sudden they change the leader, and you have, a toxic leader comes in, and so document, document, document. So again, going into a company, I was going with a skeptical eye. The company that I just went into, when I came into where I work now, one of the things I noticed very quickly, that there was a leader who liked to have their new person do a turnover, kind of quickly once they have somebody in there. I wasn't the person who would do that, just get rid of someone for the sake of getting rid of them. So I would document my conversations, make sure I was sending myself an email, putting it into folder, saying, and one of the taglines I always like to put is, I'm going to do what's right for the company as well as this employee. And I kept putting that in there, and that tended to keep that person at bay for a while. Create a coalition, right? You're probably not alone. If you're feeling a certain way, you're probably not alone in this. So try to find those other people, but avoid having one-on-one confrontations with the person. This, again, sets up an environment to have this toxic leader turn a team or people against you. So, just be careful with that. Ask for 360 reviews. Can we do some reviews where the manager's reviewing, the teams get, reviewing the manager, things like that? Can we have those discussions? The last thing is quit. Don't be a conformer. So I was telling you about the company that I worked for, where I caught the person stealing from the company. They were siding with this other person, and it bothered me. And it didn't bother me just because it was taking money out of my pocket, but it bothered me because I couldn't work for a person who, when everything was laid out in front of them, put their own ambition, which is what it was, because it was an account that this person had opened and had done a lot of stuff with. And to the point, I didn't trust them anymore. I said, I don't trust this person. I don't trust the company if they're going to put it in them. So I had to quit. And again, I quit with a 6 month old in a city that we didn't have any supports around us for family, because it was the right thing. Luckily, my wife was 100% on board and said, you got to do what you got to do. And it was the best move. And I can remember having that discussion, and I remember this toxic leader saying, you're never going to last in this other industry. You're not going to do that good. That's a really tough place. You're never going to do it well. 25 years later, I think I did all right. So, but I got to tell you, one of the things that drives me every day is remembering that conversation. But you can't be afraid to quit if you just can't go any farther with that. So one of the things, and it's interesting because I talk about this now. A couple of years ago, we never talked about whistleblowers all that much, but it's been in the news a lot. So I always like to bring this up. So one of those things are, if you're working in a toxic environment and it's purely, definitely toxic, and they're doing things that are wrong and they're breaking the law, there's a Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989. You can, what they call whistleblow, and you will receive 10 to 30% of what the government recovers if they go after these people. So the UBS bank, they were doing a lot of stuff, and the person who turned them in, they received, there was a fine of $104 million. They received a percentage of that. Interesting enough, the person who turned them in ended up spending 40 months in jail, so about just over 3 years in jail before he could get that money. But he was blowing the whistle on some illegal practices. Pfizer, the way that they were marketing a drug, there were 10 employees that went to him and said that they're not marketing it. It's actually going to hurt people. They're hiding some information, and they got $102 million from that. So those are these big kind of fines. Those are two of the top fines. Remember, if you're a whistleblower, though, there can be consequences, right? So Edward Snowden, he's whistleblowing on the government, and he ended up having to leave the country, right? Go to Russia because of he wasn't safe here. Jeffrey Wingate, they actually did a movie on him. Well, about the story, he actually blew the whistle on the tobacco industry and how they were marketing it and how they were doing things. And again, there were threats against his life. So, there's are consequences to being a whistleblower, but there are protection for you if that's something that you want to do. So it's just kind of an interesting. That's really at the far end of toxic environments and with toxic leaders. All right, so that's some stuff on kind of the toxic side of it. So just a couple other things from other work I put for this week, because I just want to kind of highlight it. So we're going to get and do a little bit more on self-awareness. Again, I think this is a really important topic for us to spend some time on. So there's a couple of TED Talks on self-awareness. So Adam Grant on the second one, he's an organizational psychologist. Tasha Henrich she does a lot of work with self-awareness. She's actually developed a self-awareness quiz. So just a reminder on that one, you're going to take the 14-question quiz and you're going to email it to someone else, and they're going to do the 14-question quiz, and you'll be able to see how your answers match up. So just make sure that you take the time to do that. I think it's really good. And then there's a Coaching for Leadership podcast that talks about how to work with a boss who's a jerk. So I thought that would be interesting to kind of tie up our toxic leadership talk chapters. And then so then next week we're going to get into authentic and servant leadership, which will be good. And I will make sure that there will be a video on your first big project that is due. So again, thank you. Hopefully you guys have a great week, and I'll look forward to talking to you next week.